Well, greetings and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, president at 1615, where I also serve as a church missions coach. I'm also joined by my co-host today, David Jackett. He's the director of mobilization and operations at 1615, and he's going to pop up at the end for some time of Q&A with our guests. Now, before we begin the webinar today, let me let you know about some upcoming events as well as some valuable resources. Two books I want to highlight: When Everything is Missions and Conversations on When Everything is Missions. And in both of these books, we address this very popular idea that every follower of Christ is a missionary, and every good work, every evangelistic work or altruistic work done in Jesus' name is a missions work. And we ask, are those biblical ideas? Are they helpful ideas? Do they lead to more missions work being accomplished or less? You can pick them up at wheneverythingsmission.com. We also have a podcast that is the same title as our first book, When Everything is Missions. You can listen to that wherever you get your podcast. And also you can go to wheneverythingismissions.com as well. The Mission Table, incredible resource. We have 3 seasons available, archived, available to watch. Season 4 is coming soon. We gather leading missions thinkers and practitioners, and we tackle some of the most critical, controversial topics impacting the missions world today. Please take advantage of this valuable, provocative, and free resource. Today's webinar is being recorded. We've been doing these since 2011, and you can watch archived episodes at 1615.org/webinars, or you can just go to 1615.org and hit on the resources button. Search a vast array of webinars on all variety of topics. There's something in there for everybody. We also have a podcast that we do with Missio Nexus called The Mission Matters. And it's a double entendre, if you can tell. The mission matters. It's very important. In fact, there's nothing happening in the world more important than the mission of Jesus Christ. And on this podcast, we talk about the matters of our mission. Once again, wherever you get your podcasts, please listen, subscribe, share with others. The Mobilized Church Workshop. So excited about this resource. It is a 2-day regional workshop. The next one will be hosted in Dallas area, November 9th and 10th. Registration is open. We're so excited to be live again. We talk about what a mobilized church looks like at this workshop, and we help churches and church leaders work through just the keys that are going to unlock their missions potential. We also have an 8-week virtual that you can register for as well. Again, visit 1615.org to learn more about that. Peer-to-peer gathering is something we do with Missio Nexus also. It's a once-a-month gathering for church missions leaders specifically. You can watch archived episodes at 1615.org, and you can participate in live events as well. This next one's coming up here, Mobilizing Generation Z. Really looking forward to that. Got some great thinkers and practitioners that are going to be on that one, so register at 1615.org. Also, a lot of great webinars that are underway here: Truths and Myths, Refugee Resettlement, and then this very challenging one about safety. Safety really is an illusion, and oftentimes our love affair with safety keeps us from taking gospel risks. So please visit 1615.org to subscribe to our webinars. You'll learn more about them there, and then also you can register to participate live. So in just a moment, I'm going to hand the controls over to our subject matter experts. They're both from Overseas Missionary Fellowship, OMF. But before I do that, just a few pointers. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. So you can listen in on your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, please type them in the question and answer panel, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. We're going to take about the last 15 or 20 minutes and allow you to interact with our subject matter experts. This is your opportunity to enter into the conversation. Because we have so many online, we're not going to open up the audio, but you can type those questions in, and then we will feed them to our guests here today. 120 people are registered for today's live webinar. I want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to watch it at 1615.org. So I'm going to turn the controls over to Brian and Erin at this point. I'm going to ask both of you to turn on your webcams, and let me thank you so much for taking time today to be with us.
All right, here we go. You guys hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Sounds great, cool. All right, well, thank you, Matthew and David and the 1615 team, just for this incredible opportunity. Aaron and I are both really excited for the series and just honored to share just the stage with some amazing brothers and sisters of color. If you haven't gotten a chance to listen to the previous 4 sessions of Mobilizing People of Color, we highly recommend you guys check them out. But before we dive in, well, we'd like to just introduce ourselves a little bit and share a little bit of our story.
My name is Erin, and I am Japanese American. My father was born at the beginning of the incarceration of the Japanese during World War II, and subsequently was forced to stop speaking Japanese. A lot of our Japanese culture and heritage was wiped away during his generation, although we were able to redeem some of it as I was growing up. My mother is Japanese speaking. We attended Japanese speaking church as a result, and a lot of our cultures and customs were influential, were the foundation of my language and of my culture growing up. I am now married to a Hmong American who was born here. His parents were born in Laos and immigrated here as part of that refugee movement as well. I joined OMF in 2005 and have been serving since then. And I now serve as an equipping coach, which means that I have the privilege of walking alongside people as they discover their role in reaching the nations. Over the years, I've also had the privilege of being part of the Lausanne movement through the Lausanne Younger Leaders gatherings and other calls and such like that.
And so I'm Brian, and so yeah, I'm a 4th generation Chinese American. So what that means is I was born here, my parents were born here, my grandparents were also born here, and it was my great grandparents that came over and immigrated in the early 1880s. And yeah, they came over to work on railroads, and we'll talk about a little bit later on. But yeah, so I first got involved with OMF in 2009. I joined staff in 2013, and now I currently serve as the director for advocacy, which oversees all of our conferences or events, and also I help lead our regional mobilization teams as well. So throughout our conversation today, we're going to share a little more of our stories as Asian Americans who have both been mobilized in missions, and now we have the privilege of mobilizing others in mission. But here's just a little kind of outline of kind of today's webinar and what we'll be looking at. We'll be first kind of starting with the context of Asian Americans. We'll be looking at the people of Asian Americans, some of the wounds and the pains that Asian Americans have experienced. And then lastly, we'll be looking at some of the practices as we look to engage and mobilize Asian Americans. But before we do, we just want to be just real honest with you guys. You know, navigating this topic has been really challenging. It's been really hard. You know, just personally as a 4th generation Chinese American, you know, one of the things I've really come to realize is that I've too often ignored my Asian American identity. And sadly, I mean, this past year has been a forcing function in me realizing and revisiting and renegotiating my identity as an American majority and as an Asian, a minority. And in many ways, I feel like I'm constantly, learning to unlearn, and then at the same time learning to learn what it means to be Asian American. And before we kind of proceed a little more, we just wanted to frame this a little bit as well. First, we just want to name what we're not. We're not, deep subject experts in missiology, ecclesiology, race, and culture. We will speak to these here. We do know about this, but that's not quite our expertise. One thing we also mentioned too is we're not speaking on behalf of all Asian Americans. As Erin and I have kind of prepared for this, we're consciously kind of reminded that we offer only a sliver of perspective, as we're both California-raised Asian Americans. We're from similar circles, and we're both serving at the same missions organization. And so while we're not experts in those areas, we are, we are learners. Erin and I, we're mobilizers. We're practitioners, and ultimately we're contributors to a larger conversation around missions, mobilization, and people of color. And so we just want to thank you guys all for being present as we kind of journey together here.
And so as we begin to look at the context of today's webinar, we realize we're building off previous parts in the series, and that we're just, again, one piece of it. We love that our brothers and sisters and previous presenters have quoted Billy Graham in his opening address of the Lausanne Congress in 1974, when Billy Graham said, "Evangelization requires the whole church to take the whole gospel to the whole world." And so before we dive more into discussion of mobilizing Asian Americans, we felt it necessary to pause and reemphasize a part of this phrase. What does whole church really mean? Do we realize that the gospel is much more fully presented when everyone is present? And not just represented, but present. And there is a fine line and a big gap definition difference there. They're not just represented, but they are present. What parts of the gospel are missing when you have a monocultural, a one-sided view of it? As Asian Americans, we are fully aware of the tensions in the U.S. regarding race relations at the moment, and that it has been tense over the past few years, and that, again, COVID has provided an opportunity for some of these things to come forth. But if we are going to truly see the whole church bring the whole gospel to the whole world, we have to work through how our ethnicities impact our structures and our approach to missions, which is what this 1615 series is attempting to do. And a lot of times I will use the analogy to describe OMF to people. I will use the picture of a kaleidoscope. And if you look into a kaleidoscope, you'll oftentimes just see a bunch of broken pieces. But if you hold a kaleidoscope to the light, then you will see broken pieces that are made beautiful. It's no longer a jumbled, unorganized mess. But all of these pieces and all of their different colors and shapes lend itself to make something tremendously beautiful and much a fuller picture.
So yeah, just as Erin was sharing this idea of a kaleidoscope here, and I just wanted to kind of camp on that for a second, and to share a little bit of my, my family's, origin story. We share this picture on the left-hand side here, not to shame or necessarily ask for apology, but just to recognize that, like, this is a part of Asian American history, one that is hardly covered in schools and mainstream media, and one that is extremely heartbreaking as you kind of dive into it. Fortunately, there are some really incredible resources available now today to kind of learn about this part of history. Recently, I was watching a TV show, and there was just this opening scene that literally, it just brought me to tears, just watching Chinese getting off the boat and just kind of trying to imagine and put together what they were greeted by and the power that was kind of wielded over them. And as I kind of reflect, despite this brokenness, and I look back at my family's kind of history, and just how redemptive it is at the same time. Like, here I am, like, to think about this, here I am today by God's grace, holding the greatest gift, Jesus, right? Mobilizing for missions amongst East Asia's peoples. But we want to have this, not only to look back at history, but we really love this image of a rail. Because ultimately, like, what are rails? Think of rails. Rails not only allow for movement, but what they do is they introduce a governing aspect to movement. Rails provide governance and guidance, right, for movement. One of the themes that this series, we've been talking about, has been examining and really seeking to understand, like, what are these rails of missions? What holds power? What instructs movement? What governs and decides how missions is done? Everything from recruitment to available opportunities, to strategy, to agency, culture, to leadership, decision-making. As Erin mentioned, as we look at seeing the whole church, right, bringing the whole gospel, right, not just on existing rails, but this conversation, right, is about this whole church being fully expressed through new rails, new modified rails, more layered rails, more dynamic and changing rails, right, so that we can really bring the whole gospel to the whole world.
And who are the people that are on the rails? Who are the carriers of the gospel, the trains and the passengers? Who are those people? Who are the Asian Americans? When you think of Asian Americans, do you think of people like Brian, Chinese, and me, Japanese, or maybe some Koreans? Or do you also think of Filipinos, Vietnamese, Thai, Indian, Khmer, Hmong, Mien, and Lao? Or what about people that are mixed Asian, Asian Black, Asian White, Asian Latino, Asian, mixed Asian, Filipino Korean, Filipino Japanese, whatever? And we've all come to America through a variety of circumstances and ways. And those who came years ago, there are those who came years ago, like Brian's family, and they came. There are some who have come for a better life in the American dream. There are those who came as refugees and asylum seekers. There's also a newer generation of millennials and Gen Zers who came as parachute kids. If you don't know what parachute kids are, go and look it up, because their stories and how they've come to the US also will impact their encounters and their approach to God. We don't have time to go over all of these different ways, but one way you can better mobilize Asian Americans is by learning our stories, taking that time to learn our history, and not just through history books, but by actually listening to the people who tell those stories. And then sitting and realizing together, how do these life stories fit into missions? Because these stories paint a picture not only of America, but how God has related to us through these experiences. God never disperses people without a purpose. And so if he has dispersed us to America, then why? For what purpose? What cause? And how he has made himself known through these experiences impacts the way in which we relate to him and the way in which we share him with others. So who are the Asian Americans that you know, and have you ever taken the time to hear their stories? I think in America, we don't take enough time to hear each other's stories, regardless of culture or ethnicity. And so, do you know the stories of the people of color in your life? And more importantly, though, do you view them as your equals? Before you answer that question, and presume your answer is yes, I want to share a story. It's a little bit vulnerable, but it's also kind of, yeah, it hits the point home. I was serving as a youth director alongside another Asian brother, and he and I were in the process of needing to transition our youth leadership of this youth group at a Chinese church to a white male counterpart. And when this guy began taking over, he thought it would be a great idea if his Bible college buddy got to bring his youth group from another state. Again, it was a white church that came to our Chinese church, and he thought it would be cool if they came to do VBS for us, for our middle school and high school youth group. They ran the kids program VBS for our middle school and high school youth group. The associate pastor of this church and the youth pastor were both part of leading this team. And throughout the week, they continuously questioned my knowledge of God, my salvation, and my knowledge of scripture. They consistently, over and over and over again, questioned it. And at one point, the associate pastor even said to me, "Oh, but Erin, you're Japanese, so you don't really get it."
So as we spent time, praying and preparing, and one of the things we've gotten a chance to do is just to really listen to a lot of other, Asian American brothers and sisters kind of in this space here. And this theme of wounds just kind of kept coming up, and it was finding that this was a really critical part of their journey, just both understanding their identity and also just related to how they understand their role and their entry into missions. And if you can imagine, like stories like Erin just shared, that you can imagine that can cause some pain, some wounding that does not go away very easily. And so we just also want to acknowledge that this word wounds can be kind of provoking. We've heard it said, this word is used too many times, it's lost its meaning. But we really wanted to intentionally kind of use this word to communicate that there is a deep kind of personal and also communal pain that Asian Americans have experienced. One of the most healing things that OMF has done just this past year, we spent a whole morning. OMF created space, and the purpose was simple. We just wanted to hear the pains and the wounding of Asian Americans, both from the past and also specifically too of the wounding and the pains that Asian Americans have faced during all the hate acts during COVID-19 over this past year and a half. And broadly speaking, we'll discuss kind of two main sources of wounding here, and kind of frame them in these kind of two stereotypes. Number one is the model minority. You guys see here on the left-hand side, this is a Time magazine from the, I believe this is from the late 80s, so this is almost 30 years, over 30 years old. And the second one is this idea of called the perpetual foreigner. And so many of you guys are familiar with these, but we just wanted to unpack these just really quickly and just kind of just talk about how these affect kind of Asian Americans and their role in missions, right? So the model minority, so what is this, right? During the 1950s and 60s, this kind of originated here. And remember, during the 50s and 60s, this is the height of the civil rights movement. And this was a time where Asian immigrants were handpicked and to basically come to the U.S. And the ones that were handpicked were specifically very gifted, very talented, they were respectful, they were motivated Asian immigrants, right? And in many ways, as we look back, we realize that they were actually quietly weaponized and pitted against our Black brothers and sisters. Basically saying, hey, why can't you behave like these minorities? They succeeded in school. Their families stay together. They're law-abiding. These are the model minorities. Like, can't you be like them? And one of the most, just one of the most first and most formative stories that I heard, from my grandpa, when I was growing up as just a little boy, he was telling stories for World War II, and and during boot camp, basically my grandpa, he was beat up because his comrades thought he was Japanese and they didn't want to serve with a guy that looked Japanese. And then as I look back on this as kind of a model minority, my grandpa, he chose not to report it. And because he was beat up so badly, he was given the option to basically to not re-enlist and to not go back into the army. But he saw it as the right thing, as as a good American, as an Asian American, to re-enlist, and that's what he did. And I remember thinking to myself, like, man, like how much of that has shaped, my posture in integrating, my experience as an Asian American throughout my entire life, just seeking to fit in. Don't raise a fit, be valued. Like, this is what you need to do in order to be valued as an American. There's a Chinese saying that says the loudest duck gets shot, or the Japanese saying that says that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, right? And so that kind of really encompasses this idea of the model minority. You don't stick out too much. Don't be too loud. Just fit in. When I was raising support to join OMF, one of the things that I still remember, some of the feedback was, oh, Brian, great, you're joining OMF, right? You're going to be raising your support. This should be easy for you. Look at all of your friends and family. They're doctors, they're engineers, they're lawyers. They're loaded with money. You'll have no problem. This will be easy. This will be quick. And just discounting just the challenge of how do I not be this loudest duck, or this nail that sticks up in this journey as I'm entering into missions. And also, at the time too, it made me wonder, what's being projected on other Asian communities with a very different experience than my own. Like, consider refugee communities with historically less financial or educational resources. And this is not to say that they don't have access to resources, but just really considering what could these actually serve as a barrier to participation in missions.
The other idea that we want to look at, and again, we know or we hope that these ideas are not new ideas for you or new concepts to you, but we want to look at them not in the context of society and externally from the church, but internally, and their impact, their direct impact on missions. And so the idea of the perpetual foreigner, that never-ending journey of not quite belonging and being seen as a foreigner or just a little different. We don't fit the part. We don't fit, like, we're not fully American because we're Asian, but when we're with Asian people, I'm not seen as Japanese to my cousins either in Japan, because I'm too American for them. So I'm too Japanese for America, but I'm too American for Japan. And so nowhere do I fit the part because of my name, the way I look, the food I eat. Brian and I both have shared stories on numerous occasions of when our lunch, bringing lunch to school, was drawn into question. Brian brought a sandwich and shrimp chips, and not many kids around him were eating shrimp chips. I'm sure they ate Doritos and things like Cheetos, right? Things like that. For me, I didn't like sandwiches. I still don't really like sandwiches, and I didn't bring sandwiches to lunch until later on when it was so shamed into me to bring sandwiches to school, because I got made fun of for bringing like rice balls, onigiri, and things that I liked to school for lunch. And even as adults, we've had people make fun of our lunches. So it doesn't stop when you're kids. It's mean adults too. And so even in that example of just simply food, that questions who decides the rails, who holds the power. And for me, I was shamed into bringing sandwiches to school because so many kids around me thought my food was weird. So who holds the power? Who holds the power in our churches? Who questions what's served or what is done? And so, yeah, have you stopped to think about how these types of things, the perpetual foreigner and the model minority, are expressed and seen in our churches? What is expected of Asian Americans as individuals and as leaders? I have seen more times than I would care to admit, in a majority white church, the person of color who is going to be a leader, an elder, that person of color has to go through an elder apprenticeship. But when a white counterpart, a white brother or sister going into the role, a leadership role within the church, needs to do no such apprenticeship, does not need to fill out an application or do an interview, they're just welcomed on. Asians and other people of color have to jump through more hoops. I'm sure you've heard this said, but this is the reality. They've had to jump through more hoops and do more work to prove their capability. Again, when white counterparts are not required to do the same. We're not saying that the more work should not be required, but if it's going to be required, then require it of everybody and not just Asians or other people of color. And if you want to learn more about the Asian American identity, we'd really encourage you to check out the resources at Asian American Christian Collaborative. They've got a great bibliography of resources for you to read and to utilize.
So we're asking this question, so what do we do, right? What does this have to do with missions? And really, in the end, we're asking this question, how, as mobilizers, how might we engage, right? If you've traveled to Asia before, you've probably seen, this or heard this phrase before, and we really love this as a framing of this last part of our discussion here. Same, but different. And so the way that we wanted to kind of use this here and to really look at it, so what are these like kind of same practices that we as mobilizers do, but how are they different, right? How are they contextualized and experienced differently from an Asian American perspective?
We're going to go back to basics for this. We're going to look at Lloyd Quast's model of understanding culture. If you've taken perspectives, you're probably familiar with this, or if you've been involved in missions for a while, you're probably familiar with this. But we oftentimes use this understanding culture when serving cross-culturally overseas or in a foreigner's world, right? Even working in refugee communities, but we don't apply it with Asian Americans or anybody else. But the reality is that even though we speak English and some of our mannerisms and behaviors might be the same, it might be because we've made ourselves more white and adapted to American culture. But at the core, the worldview and our values and the systemic reasons for why we do what we do, it's all very different. And so we have to look at worldview, what is real to Asian Americans, what is real, what is true, what is good, what is best, our worldview, what is real, that our community and the fellowship is central, honoring others and holding one another's better, treating one another's better than yourself. That's a worldview reality for Asian Americans. What is true is that my life needs to reflect my community and honor the others and not bring shame to them. So I'm going to value whatever is good or whatever is best for others and for the community. And when we become believers, that good or best is what is good or best for the kingdom and my community. And so what is done? What is the most noble? What is the most honoring? The least shameful, the path of least resistance for us. And there are going to be other things too. And so just like sharing the gospel in a new context, again, we've got to look at mobilizing Asian Americans and people of color through this lens so that we understand why the things that are done are done. So let's evaluate our organizations before we presume that just because something appears to be the same actually is. Let's evaluate our organizations. Let's go back to the rails illustration that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, so kind of building off what Erin was saying here, just kind of consider the rails, right? Like these are these pieces, involved in our organizational structures. These are our practices, these are our ethos, these are our cultures, right? And one of the things that we wanted to ask is, can we be more literate? Can we name these rails of our organization around mobilizing, around training, around sending, around caring for missionaries? One of the things, one of the examples that I was thinking back on that I think that OMF did really well so hiring, right? So when I was hired, and I was joining staff and I started raising support, all that, our VP of mobilization at the time was Robert, and he actually reached out to my parents and introduced himself and he just thanked my parents. He just said, we love Brian. We're so excited to have him. He is so gifted. Thank you for raising just an amazing son. And I remember watching this interaction, and this was unprompted from me, unprompted from anyone else, and just to see just that affirmation and that gratitude from my parents, and then also that gratitude from me as well to see Rob do that. And so how might these, be, bridges or barriers, for people of color? If you look at all different processes of your organization, right? The financial structures, the leadership, the decision making, how might, Asian Americans fit in? How might they be built in? How might they be allowed and empowered to help reimagine, right, new rails? And then now we want to kind of zoom in a little more on a practical level, right? What are some, we want to go a little deeper, right? And what are some optically similar practices that might mean very different things? Many of us have all heard it say, if you're traveling throughout the South, you've heard it say, people say bless her heart or God bless him, right? And really on the surface, it's not a blessing, right? So we're kind of looking at these same, but different here. And so the first one, I don't know, maybe Erin wants to share this one here, but yeah.
Yeah, let me share this story. So I'll tell you, one of the things that we wanted to talk about that might be same but different is regarding food. And we've noticed that at a lot of mobilization events and things of this nature, conferences and such, there will be food offered to students or whoever the attendees might be. And but we've noticed that food is used very differently. And so when one of our mobilizers is going to speak at Harvard of the West, UC Riverside, where Brian went to school, I told that mobilizer, I said, hey, you're going to go meet with those students and it's going to probably go late. So make sure you feed them. And when I said make sure you feed them, it wasn't like bring pizza as a bait because college students are always hungry, but it was, this is how we show love to these students. This is how we show love to the community. And it was Asian American Christian Fellowship. And so I said, yeah, make sure you feed the students, bring pizza or something, that'll be easy. Food wasn't strategy for us. Food was community. Food is what we came around, and it's just kind of expected. You don't show up to someone's home without food when you go to visit an Asian home, and food is community for us. Food is a gathering point, but it's how we build trust. And coming together, there always just happens to be food. But food for us builds that trust. It means that there can be conversations that can be facilitated, and it's where as you build that trust, you earn the permission to ask the questions about the stories. permission to hear and to get to know people on a little bit of a deeper level. And those are the stories that you want to hear, the stories that we told you to ask. So food is, again, part of our community. It's not bait.
You know, as we were, Erin and I got a chance to listen to a lot of different kind of, folks and just a lot of Asian Americans. And one of the common things we kind of heard, and we kind of narrowed it down to this kind of phrase here: agenda versus person. And we kind of use this example here of, like, many of us have been to missions conference. See, this is a picture we grabbed off. This is from Urbana, and many of us have been to these big missions conferences, and there's specific exhibit hall times, the agenda, right, where you're there, and there's that expectation of you're going to be talking to people, they're asked about missions and all that stuff. Yes, there's personal kind of chit chat in there as well. But one of the things we were kind of finding, just as we were talking with a lot of Asian Americans, as you reflected back on our own stories too, what was the things that really moved the needle? And we realized that it wasn't necessarily the spaces that were that was built into the agenda, but it was all the spaces in between, before, in the middle, and after, right, or the after party. And just how, like, when Asian Americans had a chance to really get to know organizations or get to know people. I remember there's something that was like 2013 or 2015 or 2012, sorry, Urbana, or 15 Urbana. I remember, like, you do 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, you talk to hundreds of people at the booth kind of thing. And I remember getting a text message that, like, oh, there's going to be folks hanging out afterwards. And this wasn't like, I didn't really see it as like, oh, here's my chance to really mobilize kind of thing. But honestly, I was like, you know what, this is really the space where I get to really build relationships really and go deeper, and they get to see me, and to see me, not just caring for them because I want them to join my organization, but to really care for them, because I want to be your friend. I want to know you. I want to know your story. I want to share a meal with you in a packed hotel room with with 30 people kind of thing, passing pizza around the room kind of thing, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Erin, did you want to kind of build off this one too?
Yeah, it's not just the extroverts that stick around. It's not just the extroverts that come to hang out when it's an Asian American deal. Even the introverts, and people who know me think, some people who know me on the surface think that I'm an extrovert, but people who really know me see the introverted side, and they see the part that retreats away. And so it's not just the extroverts. I can function as an extrovert, but the introverts will come too, because it's a place to gather. It's a safe space. And it's a place where we can just be present and be ourselves. We can hang out and sit and not say a thing. We can hang out and play games if we want, or just being there, but being present together, because community is everything. The other thing too about agenda is that there is a schedule, right, at these conferences and such. And a lot of organizations go and their whole purpose is to recruit. But the reality is that for us as Asian Americans, we can tell a mile away when we're an agenda for somebody and a part of a strategy and not a person. And it's hurtful, it's disrespectful, and we can tell when we're an agenda.
The other kind of topic we kind of come across of too, that's really wanted to unpack a little more is this topic of leadership. And I wanted to kind of share just a quick example. So this is AACF, this is Asian American Christian Fellowship, college fellowship at my college campus, Harvard the West, UC Riverside. And yeah, and I remember just kind of reflecting back, there's a distinct difference on how leadership was chosen. Many of us, I'm sure many of us here are in places of leadership. We're in organizations, churches, nonprofits, agencies, or other spaces, and we all, I think most of it will agree that having this diversity in leadership roles is really important, and we want that, and we're inviting that, and we're looking for that, right? And so, yeah, so I don't know, I just wanted to kind of share this personal kind of like, not testimony, but it's just like something I was noticing a little bit, in AACF, in larger, specifically around Asian churches and Asian fellowships. I noticed that it was really interesting how leadership was chosen. You know, um, you know, it was not a here's the job description. Hey, sign up in the back. We'll raise your hand, come forward. But the way that leadership was chosen in WCF and in a lot of other spaces was basically you were nominated by your peers, by existing leadership. You were encouraged and nurtured by staff before you even signed up. And so I just thought that was a really interesting thing because now that I'm in my role with OMF, realizing that OMF is a little bit hybrid of both, in some ways. Where OMF, we do have a tangible job description, which is great, and it sets expectations, is really clear, and all that. And I remember as I was, considering this role, director of advocacy, there was an opportunity to fill it, but I passed. At the time I was, trying to be faithful. There was another position that I was doing within OMF that I committed to. I really wanted to just to be, finish that really, really well. But yeah, I was like the same. I was like, this opportunity looks really interesting. But yet there was this kind of feeling deep down inside. I was like, no, you shouldn't really apply for maybe, just wait, Brian, kind of thing. But it wasn't actually until our president, Michael Littlefield at the time, U.S. president and national director, I remember, he just, Michael has this thing. He would just walk around the office kind of thing and just kind of say hi to people. And one time he was walking by, I thought it was just another kind of come by, kind of wave, say hello, check in kind of thing. But he stopped and he came to my office. He sat down and he says, Brian, I've been praying, and I've been watching you, and he had the job description in front of me. He put it there, but he kind of put it to the side. And he says, Brian, I want you to consider this role. He's like, I've seen you speak. I've seen you teach. I've seen you engage with the people. I think you would do so well here. And I don't know, and that did something inside of me that kind of motivated me to say, okay, I think I should do this, or that little nudging there. And so, yeah, and so that's just something we wanted to kind of name there around leadership as we're looking to expand leadership and to bring Asian Americans in. And once Asian Americans are in the role, I think Erin has talked about this, what's expected, right, of these Asian Americans? Are they expected to speak up more often? Are they expected to speak out loudly more often that they traditionally might be comfortable with? Are they expected to contradict and critique their superiors or peers in public during some of these meetings, right? And that can be kind of challenging for some Asian American leaders. And so, yeah. And so, lastly, on this last slide here, we just wanted to name a couple more. Just some practices that I think were really relevant to Asian Americans. And the first one here is just around honoring parents. And yeah, Erin, do you want to pick up on this one here?
Yeah, one of our colleagues, David Narita, actually did a really great survey on Asian Americans, which can be found on the Missio Nexus website. If you go to Missio Nexus and use the search engine and type in David Narita Asian American survey, it'll come right up. It'll do the same thing if you Google it too. But one of the biggest challenges that was cited in that survey was honoring parents, and a very important aspect for Asians and for a lot of cultures. We acknowledge that. But again, what's done on the outside, the behavior, honoring parents is very different for Asian Americans because of what's internally, right? That worldview perspective. So everybody honors and respects their parents, sure, but Asian Americans, that value, that worldview is very different. And so that's why we have to clarify this. But what does it mean for us to honor our parents? Many of us come from traditions that might be Buddhist in nature, and there's a practice in Buddhism that says you have to care for your ancestors even after they've died, or they're not cared for well in the afterlife. We have to take care of them. And so who's going to take care of their grave if we become believers, if we go overseas? And so even as believers, that notion and that idea, that value of honoring parents to that degree and not bringing shame to them or the community by being the child that is begging for funds from other people and bringing shame on the parents because, oh, the parents can't take care of them, the kids can't take care of the parents. It's just shameful both ways. What does it mean for us to honor parents as we go overseas? And how do we care for them as they age if we go overseas or serve in full-time ministry? And therefore our financial resources are limited to care for them. Like, what does this all mean, and how does this happen for us? Getting the approval of our parents is important. There's a challenge of how do we honor our parents while blatantly sometimes disobeying them. For those of us who've come from immigrant families who came here, quote unquote, for the better life, going back to places, when you've come from Taiwan, going back to Taiwan, coming from Japan, going back to Japan, coming from China, going back to China, et cetera, going back to those places that they came from to share the gospel is like a slap in the face. Like, what they did was not good enough. And what they did, we don't, it's not a big deal to us. We're gonna do our own thing. It's disrespectful and shameful to them. OMF leadership also met my parents. Brian talked about this earlier, but my dad, as I said, is Japanese American, born in the U.S. at the start of the incarceration of the Japanese during World War II. But Mark Bradley, who was our director for mobilization at the time I came onto staff, had served in Japan and had enough insight to say, you know, Erin, I think maybe if I meet your dad, things will change. And sure enough, he went to go honor my dad and said some similar things that Robert said to Brian's parents, but he said, we see a lot of God's gifting in Erin, and said a lot of different things. And after that meeting, my dad called me and said, nah, so-and-so's with OMF, right? In Japan? Yeah. So-and-so's dad is OMF Japan, right? Yeah. And so-and-so's daughter is also OMF, right? Yeah. Oh, so OMF must be good, huh? And I said, yeah, Dad, OMF is good. Oh, okay, have a good day. Hung up. That's the only blessing, but that is all the blessing that I needed to hear from my dad, to know that it was okay. But God had him on a journey as much as he had me on a journey. But I needed to honor my dad in that. It's not just the individual who goes, it's the individual in the community. A lot of times as mobilizers, we see an individual, but it's an individual and their community. When I go, my brother goes, my sister goes, my dad, like everyone's involved in me being a mobilizer and me being involved in missions. There is an inquirer who came to us recently through another, who was introduced to me by another mobilizer of a different organization. And that person said, you know, this guy's got a long way to go, but I think, you know, you've got a better shot at him than I do. Can you talk with him? You can relate with him better. And so sure enough, we had this conversation, and he starts out by telling me that he's got at least 2 or 3 years before he can go to the field. And when we talked, as we talked more and more, I said, well, it just sounds to me like there are some family dynamics and family issues to be worked through, but that actually you're really ready to go. And so there's no reason for you to delay the process. So he prayed about it. And as he prayed about it, then he said, I think I'm ready to apply. And so it looks like he might be applying to come with us. Instead of in 2023, he's been hoping to come to as early as this year, this fall candidate course. So we'll see what happens. The Matthew 19 passage has been quoted at us by well-intended, well-meaning white colleagues, and not just as mobilizers, but even pre me being involved in missions. Erin, you've got to forsake your father and mother and follow Jesus. That's what he says. And while that's true, there are other nuances and other things involved in that process. There are witness opportunities and different things that are involved in that process. It's not just a cut and go. Because for a lot of us in Asian circles, when we cut ourselves off from our families, we don't cut ourselves off just in name, like distance-wise, but we get our names wiped off of family trees. We have no relation. We are disowned by family. And yes, we need to be willing to go to those lengths, but there's a lot of room in between for those discussions to happen. We need to be willing, yes, if that's required. But again, there's that conversation and that dialogue, that witness, that spiritual journey that our families are on as much as we are. And so there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen in between them, a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration before we can just cut and go.
And lastly here, just one of the most commonly cited, not surprisingly, challenges is raising support, right? And raising support in Asian American communities. And you can imagine, right? This is a very, layered, there's so many layers in dynamics with money, in Asian American and Asian kind of circles, around relationships, around power, around value. Just as a little if you get a chance to watch how an Asian family or an Asian kind of community of friends deals with a check at dinners, it's a very interesting dynamic, not just to kind of observe and watch during, but like afterwards, and how it kind of plays out, before and after the table too. It just shows you just how layered and challenging and nuanced it really is. But as you engage with Asian Americans, in this space of support raising, don't be scared of it. Dive into it, prod around. Seek to ask, deep heart issues. Yes, it might be challenging to navigate some of the nuances with raising support kind of thing. But at the same time, I think, one thing that was really personal to me was realizing that the only reason why a job at Google or Facebook or whatever it is, right, was quote unquote secure was because ultimately God allows it. God allows it, and the exact same reason, if God's going to allow my role in missions to be secure, is ultimately because He allows it. And I think that was really helpful. And then one of the last things too, and this is something I really appreciate about OMF, is this idea of needs-based versus job-based. And this is not, critiquing one or the other. Typically, either you're paid based upon here's the job that you do, the role that you are, here's your title, and your job and your compensation is matched accordingly. But one of the things I've really appreciated about OMF is that we raise support, and our salary is based upon our needs. And so there really is that deep discerning, walking with our supervisor and letting them understand and really deeply kind of help, navigate and discern what is a need. And then basically not just empowering us, but to really encourage and say, yes, this is a need. You need to raise support for this year. You need to raise support to take care of family or your brothers or something like that, that maybe might be different than simply a job-based kind of salary or wage. And so, yeah, so I don't know, that's kind of we'll move to the last slide here, but.
We've talked about a lot on the surface level today, and we have just scratched the surface of a lot of topics, and we've gone quickly over a lot of things. We'd really want to be able to give you, the organizer in me wants to be, the teacher in me wants to be able to give you a really nice 3-point sermon type of outline of what to do and what not to do when mobilizing Asian American brothers and sisters. But reality is that it's more like this photo here. This is from Young Lu's infographic. If you haven't ever seen it, it was an infographic series titled East Meets West. Young Lu is based in Germany. And in this photo, this particular infographic is on networking. And I think even the title of networking lends itself to say this is for a Western audience, because this is not networking for us. This is relationships. And I think over the years, I've learned that relationships for a lot of Americans is much more one-to-one. Whereas when we were at training, sometimes I would be chided by Caucasian colleagues. Why do the Asians always have to figure out who they know? And like you're not even from the same place. Like she's from New Jersey and you're from California. Like, why would you know each other at all? Why do you have to do that? You exclude other people. The Asians are making, the rest of us feel excluded because we don't have those same things. Like, why and how do you know each other? But we just do. There are people in this webinar, like, who are from Dallas that I know, and I've never lived in Dallas, right? There are people in the webinar from the East Coast, and I've never lived on the East Coast either. But our relationships are mixed up. Our relationships are intertwined, and I can hand somebody over to a colleague, Sophia, over at Send, and I can maintain contact with that person, and Sophia might maintain contact with the person that she's brought to OMF, because it's about relationship for us, not territory. Send and OMF, it's about relationship. It's about sharing together and building the kingdom. And so that's what it's like for us. And so please don't be offended if we do that a little bit, because that's our community. But unfortunately, there's another elephant in the room, so to speak, that we need to address. And we thought about putting this at the beginning of the presentation to talk about this elephant in the room at the beginning. But just yesterday, a tweet by at Kyle James Howard was posted, and it puts things more succinctly and better language than we ever could. And so please hear our hearts, as you've probably started reading this already, but please hear our hearts as I read this and as you read it. The language and the illustration, it hits deep places. And I'm gonna try to read it without crying. But this needs to be addressed in order for, if we are going to move forward with action past discussion with regard to diversity in missions. And so especially as we come to the end of the near the end of this 1615 series on mobilizing people of color, we feel it's necessary to read this. Kyle James Howard says this: many Black Christians who once dwelt in white evangelical spaces have left them and are now talking about race dynamics from tables they've built rather than at tables where they're guests and have to coddle hosts due to that. Many white evangelicals are having trouble with this. They're used to having all the power, and they're used to wielding their power in such a way that Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC, especially Black, have had to be extremely careful and sanitized in speech, lest they offend and be ostracized within said spaces as they sit as guests at tables not their own. So many have claimed they want racial reconciliation, but it had to be on their terms, and it was superficial. They didn't truly want change. They just want diversity as a furnishing for their homes, and so they invited us to their tables, but demanded we keep their house rules. So the challenge and the charge here for us is, do we really want diversity? Are we aware of the cost and the sacrifices that might need to be made in order to build the table and to eat in a space that God Himself desires, that would honor Him and glorify Him and reflect Him more fully, that whole church, whole gospel, the whole world? And so before we look any further, Adrian Pay in his book, The Minority Experience, has said this, and I want to close here with this: before any process is initiated, our motives must be clear. If we're only seeking to diversify for tactical or pragmatic reasons, we won't truly benefit from all that minorities in our organizations have to offer. They will simply be a means to an end, and we will treat them in tokenizing ways. He then goes on further to ask the question, are we willing to listen and absorb stories of pain? Are we willing to confront imbalances and abuses of power in our organization? Are we willing to explore the impact of the past in the U.S. and in our organization?
We again want to thank Matthew and David for this space here to share, and very much credit to them, and building and allowing us to have this table. They did not set the agenda. They did not set the table for us. They did not tell us what's on the menu, and they've let us really build this here. So we really appreciate and really thankful for just this opportunity here. And so, yeah, we just wanted to open it up. We'll probably pass it back to Matthew to field some of the questions.
Well, Brian and Erin, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insights. It's clear to me that you put significant time into laboring over the things that you shared today. It was really rich, really rich. David, you're welcome to join us at this point if you want to turn on your webcam. David is our Director of Mobilization and Operations, and he actually made the connection here with OMF. So thankful to continue this conversation about mobilizing people of color. Again, for those of you still online, there's a lot of you as well. We have the next 10 or 15 minutes to open it up for you to enter into the conversation with Brian and Erin. So just type your questions in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will address them. David and I will shoot them their direction here. David, you got some of those queued up?
Yeah, again, thank you guys so much. I'll just add mine. It's not only for, it's just been a joy to get to know the both of you, and I hope that continues. And we'll continue to talk about this and hopefully Marvel and other fun things as well. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today. So one of the questions from Teresa, she says, or she asks, how would you advise a young Asian American who wants to go into the ministry, but non-believing parents oppose this? What does honoring your parents look like in this situation?
Teresa, you are not alone. I will say this. If this is you, I don't know if this is you or somebody else, but because I don't know you, I can't see you. I'm so sorry. But for those who come from unbelieving families, I'll share a little bit more. So my dad was nominal believer at best, and really didn't. My family is majority Buddhist on my mom's side and Shinto on my dad's side. And so again, it's not just about honoring parents, but the whole family. And so when we come from a family of non-believers, there is a lot of prayer. And so when walking with somebody, or if this is you, we have to consider and think about, what does our witness look like among them as we are going about this pursuit of bringing God to the nations? What does our witness look like? Is there a complete disregard for our family's opinion? Or do we honor our parents by saying, I know that this hurts you, and I appreciate all that you've done. The general director of OMF, Patrick Fung, there's an Urbana interview with him that you can look up, but he shares the story of how when he and his wife were preparing to go overseas, they were doctors prior to their departure overseas. They took their entire life savings and they honored they had prayed about it, but this was the way that God led them to honor their parents. But they took their whole life savings and they gave it to their parents so that their parents would be cared for. Their parents knew that they would be cared for. That was their symbol and their way of honoring them going into this. And for every family, it's going to be different. And so that's why getting to know the family dynamics and the history of the story, it's important. I wish there was a cut and dry, black and white answer, do this, don't do that, but it's really not. For all of us, it's going to be different. For me, it was taking that time with my dad and always inviting him into the journey, into the process, even as he was a nominal believer. And I watched his faith just soar in this whole process. And my aunt, who wasn't a believer, when my mom passed away, she had become a believer. And so this was all still very new for her too. And some of her Buddhist ties were very strong there as well. And so a lot of that undoing was happening for her as I came into this journey as well.
Now I want to key off that with this next question here. I think it's related, but what happens if parents say no to the children going back or going to the field as missionaries? And to your point, it's not a cut and dry, it's not a black and white, but maybe you could give some counsel. If there has been, as you've described, the time to walk that journey with your parents to help them try and understand. But if they finally, you arrive at a place where it's like, we don't approve of this, maybe you could speak to that. That's certainly got to be a challenging situation.
Yeah, there's one particular, I've heard this happen multiple times. In some Asian cultures, I don't want to name the specific ethnic group people group that this comes from, but there has been traditionally, we have seen where the moms specifically will lock themselves in the bathroom and threaten to commit suicide on that bathroom floor with the door locked. Wow. As they were screaming and crying and telling their children they will kill themselves if they go overseas. You leave on that plane tomorrow and I will kill myself before you leave, or I'll kill myself when you go. And that has gone on throughout the whole story. And knowing that your parents are not believers, or your parents are believers and they're still saying the same thing, because you've just shamed me and you're going and I can't believe you're doing this, I'm going to kill myself. It's brought so much shame on our family. That is, I don't want to say that's the extreme, because that's normative for some of us, unfortunately. But there is that walk, and this is what we have to trust the Lord for, to say, God, will you minister to them? Will you meet them? I am following you and I'm laying it all out on the line. But I'm trusting that when we get on that plane tomorrow, that my mom's not going to follow through with what she said. it has to push us deeper into the heart of God. And as I have watched my friends who have done this, and I have heard my friends' moms on the ground screaming and crying, and we are pleading with them, and we are begging them, and we are hearing them say, "You bring shame to us." It is the hardest thing to bear. But when we walk in full trust of the Lord will release. I have watched the Lord release all of them to the field. And as the Lord himself has released them with his blessing to the field, we have seen some, not all, but some of these parents come to faith because they've said, this God you worship must really be worth it.
Yeah, so powerful. What has surfaced many times today that I think really needs to be ruminated over is that if we want to be a part of mobilizing Asian American Christians, that the parent factor is huge. The honor that is given to parents. I was in the Philippines years ago, been several times, but as I was, developing a partnership with some Filipino believers, he asked me about convalescent homes because they were just anathema to them. He couldn't imagine that, you would put your parents in a home. Of course, there's nuance in that as well. Sometimes it's the parents in our context that want to go, right? But he said, please explain that to me. My parents are going to die in my home. That was his response. And anyway, I just think that's important. That's an important feature. If we want to work together to mobilize Asian American Christians, the parent factor has got to be considered.
And again, I said this earlier, but I cannot tell you the number of times that Matthew passage and other passages, take up your cross. This is your cross to bear. Take up your cross and follow Jesus and just trust Jesus with your parents. And yes, but can you absorb the painful reality that we are walking in?
Yeah. David, do you have another question to shoot their way from our audience?
Yeah, so Daniel asks, as an Asian, how can, it sounds like, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but how can we be more personal in mobilizing other Asians in a majority white church context without them feeling, he says that they're being a part of the strategy, but I think he means without them feeling like they're not a part of the strategy. Maybe that's a bold assumption, but I'm assuming he's not trying to mobilize Asians apart from his church, if that makes sense.
Is the question around, so in the context of a traditionally a white church and Asian Americans there, and how do you kind of work with Asian Americans in that context? Is that the kind of the question?
Yeah, it sounds like he's saying, how can you be more personal in mobilizing other Asians in a majority white church without the greater context feeling like they're not a part of that strategy?
Oh, got it.
So,
Okay.
but one Asian mobilizing other Asian Americans?
Correct.
Sorry, say that again one more time, Erin.
I think because the beginning part of the question was as an Asian, so I'm presuming Daniel's Asian, and so he's talking about they're all in a majority white church, but there's a number of Asian Americans that need to be mobilized, and so without them feeling like a part of the strategy. I think, Daniel, if we're understanding your question correctly, and you can email us if we've got it totally wrong, and we'll set up time to chat, but I think part of the reality when you are in a majority white church is that those relationships are being built. And so some of the questions that we can ask and that I've asked fellow Asian Americans, again, in a majority white context, has been, how has God uniquely gifted us and wired us? And why has God given us our Asian Americanness that allows us to hop in and out of these cultures so that we serve as a bridge? Both in a missions cross-cultural missions context, but also here in a majority white church. Like, how do we help build that bridge so that our white brothers and sisters can understand other cultures better and see things better? How can we be that bridge? And so asking those questions and mobilizing them in that sense. And I'm saying we're not a strategy, but we're just us, and we've got to get involved. So what's our part? What's our role? And yeah, how do we do this?
Yeah, so I think let's end with this. This is kind of a two-pronged question, and if you both want to take a stab at it, you can, or if you want to split it up. But I think when we talk about, I know I can see a lot of the names. I know a lot of people are here are mobilizers. A lot of people are here representing churches as well. And so if we were to say, not solving the mobilization problem, but if we were to say, hey, here's a great first step. If you are a church staff member, a pastor, and you desire to mobilize Asian Americans within your church or within your community, what would a good first step be? And again, I want to reemphasize, we're going to continue this conversation in the future. And then maybe on the agency side, for those who are working like at OMF or other agencies who are mobilizers, I think many of them desire to see a more holistic view of the church represented. What would be a good first step for them as well? So kind of both sides of the same coin.
You want to tackle the first one, or?
Well, you go for it, Brian. You take it all.
First question is around that kind of that first step. Is that right? Okay. Yeah, the first step. Yeah, I mean, oh man. I mean, I think there are so many different steps. I think if I had to kind of put a theme around it, it's that idea of learning and in putting yourself in a space to learn, and not just in the traditional like a book or a video. Those are great, and those are, there's plentiful, and we do encourage that too. But learning from a personal level too, and getting to know a local, Asian American, just as a friend, just as a brother, just as a sister kind of thing. And really nuancing, checking like that heart of like, I'm not using them as I just want to be their friend kind of thing, right? And that's the start of that longer term journey. And I watched some of our colleagues who are white, who are involved in these Asian American spaces and do it really well. And it is that long term being involved in that relationship building, sharing so many meals together, is that key, and it is really built up over time. The second question is around, from the agency standpoint, I think the first thing, I know this is more specific to me. One of the things I was just telling Erin afterwards, or before this too, was, I was reflecting back, and, there's so many opportunities to mobilize and stuff like that amongst Asian Americans. And one of the things I've kind of really leaned toward, and one of the things I've never said no to, is when there's opportunities to speak to youth. At youth retreats, whether it be FCBC, LA, or DC Cube up in Davis.
I'll translate him for you all.
Yeah, First Baptist Church in LA, or Korean Church out here in Denver, or the Chinese Church out here in Denver, kind of thing. Having the opportunity to go to the retreats and just to be present with them, and not to say, hey, look at me, I can do it, you can do it as well, but just to simply be present with them, and have that story be just a living testament of God's goodness and what God can do. And so I think expanding that would be kind of my thought to that question there.
Some great stuff. I like to ask the question at the end of a webinar, what have we learned here today? And I realize it's hard to distill it, and that's what we just tried to do with a couple of next steps. But as I was listening to both of you, I was taking notes. This is what I wrote down: mobilization as a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something we miss in a lot of contexts and situations, but let's view mobilization as a relationship. And then Erin, something you said about understanding culture, and you use that cultural framework, and you said, we employ these principles and practices in a foreign field context, but we don't apply them when we're working with the church domestically. That's profound. To go into those situations as a listener and a learner, those very same practices that are used in the field when you're contextualizing, use them here when you're building relationships cross-culturally, or just with the church in general. I think agency people don't cross that agency church bridge sometimes. Contextualize, consider their context, what they're dealing with. And then the other thing I wrote down was noodles. Okay, food came up many times as a pathway to building relationship, and you're speaking my language. I'm a foodie. That noodle burger, I want it. The ramen, I don't know if you saw that at the beginning. I think you chose those. but it really is amazing how food is it's something we use to worship. Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it all for God's glory. But it's also a means to relationship. You know, thank God for this food. They're ingesting it, I'm ingesting it. We're becoming, you know, friends. And I think that is so powerful, which goes back to the idea that this just takes time. This is not open package mixed ingredients. I know there's a lot of history, complexities, etc. But at the end of the day, we need to demystify this. We need to love one another and build relationships with one another, which doesn't happen overnight, right? So anyway, that's my takeaway. I don't know if it speaks to anyone else still online, but if you want to be a part of mobilizing the whole church, you have to build relationships with people, period. Amen?
Amen.
All right. Well, listen, both of you, thank you so much. David, thank you for your part in this as well, for making this connection. I want to remind everyone this has been recorded. You can watch this and view this at 1615.org, and we hope you'll be a part of future webinars as well. So I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615, along with my co-host here, David. Thanks for being with us today.